This is one of those dishes that looks and tastes super fancy but is actually very straightforward to make. You don't need complicated techniques or expensive ingredients, just a little time and patience and you've made an incredible meal that is sure to impress.
The secret lies with Lamb Shanks. They're a cheaper cut of meat, but that's exactly what makes this dish work.
Cheaper cuts need longer cooking times, otherwise they're too tough. But you embrace that and you end up with something so tender and flavorful that it's just as good as any expensive filet mignon. But it's also so easy to make, it's as easy as turning on your oven. I'll start with patting dry the lamb shanks and hitting them with salt and pepper. Then grab a deep pot like a Dutch oven and set on a high heat. Touch of olive oil and sear the shanks to get a bit of flavor in the pan and a nice brown crust on the meat. These things are always oddly shaped, so no need to stress trying to get every inch browned off. We don't need to seal the whole thing, it's all getting braised in the end. And once that's got some beautiful colour, set them aside as we start building the braising liquid. In the same pot, add a bit more olive oil and turn to a low heat so we can add the sofrito.
Now, sofrito sounds a bit too complex and fancy for you, don't worry, it isn't. It's diced onion, carrots, and celery that uses an aromatic flavor base for both sauces. You may have heard the term mirepoix, which is basically the same thing, but in France they cook it in butter. If you add a bit of bell pepper into it, you end up getting more South American variations of it. It's basically just vegetables being sauteed at the start of the sauce to get some aroma and flavor into it. Be fully balanced by using equal amounts of each three.
I found the ratio is quite handy for getting the amounts roughly the same. Just double each one. 1 onion to 2 carrots to 4 celery sticks. Begin sweating down the veg with a big hit of salt so they soften up a bit but don't brown. About 5 minutes. Then drop in some roughly chopped garlic and let that cook out for a few more minutes. Then I like to add in some tomato puree or paste and cook that for another minute or so. And now we get to the fun part. This braising liquid is not only going to be the vessel to turn our lamb shanks incredibly tender, but it'll also become a luxurious, glossy, delicious red wine jus, and without having to put in any extra effort.
Now, don't stress about the wine. It doesn't need to be some expensive fancy thing to make lots of flavor. A decent wine is going to be just fine. I've got an Argentinian Malbec from Cabrini, which is pair really well, but whatever red wine you've got is going to be just fine. Now, to know the right amount, all you got to do is grab yourself a glass. Then whatever's left in the bottle is going to be the right amount. Plus, you get a nice glass of wine while you're good.
Pour in the wine, and I like to get it to simmer already just to cook off a bit of the alcohol and reduce it slightly. No idea how much of an impact this has, but I thought it tasted less bitter than without, so I'm sticking with it. Then in goes stock. I'm using beef for a meatier taste, and optionally a tin of crushed tomatoes or passata. I like the sweetness it brings, but it's totally up to you. Stir that to combine, and for a few extra hits of flavour, I'm adding thyme and a few bay leaves too. Now we bring our lovely shanks in and submerge them as best you can. It's not always possible to get them fully submerged. I just try and get as much of the meat under. You can always turn them over halfway through, so every side gets a turn. Bring the liquid back to a simmer and then cover with a lid, and that's going to roast in the oven for a good 2.5 hours to slowly break down the meat. Then we remove the lid to let the sauce reduce and let the meat caramelize and brown a bit more by putting it back in the oven for another 30 minutes, which is just the right amount of time to make the perfect accompaniment, mashed potato. Now I could make a whole nother video on all the tips and tricks behind getting the perfect mash, and I may actually do that. Let me know in the comments if that's something you want to see. But for this video, let's cover some of the most key elements behind a great mashed potato. It's a lot easier than you think. First things first is to get some potatoes. There are quite a few varieties that work well. I use Maris Piper here in the UK. I think Yukon Gold in the US is also a good type. The key is to peel them and then cut into fairly big chunks. I used to dice them up really small as I thought A, it sped up the cooking, and B, it made it easier to get a smooth consistency. But when the pieces are small, it actually absorbs too much water. And I can tell you, moisture absolutely ruins a mash. Of course, you could bake the potato, which is actually the best way to make mash, but who on earth has time for that? Once the potatoes are peeled and chunked, the next thing is to rinse them. You'll probably notice the starch on these. It's what often makes the potatoes stick to your knife when you're chopping them. That starch makes mashed potato go all gloopy and stretchy. And what we want is light and fluffy. So rinse it in cold water until the water becomes clear to rid them of the starch. Then add them to a saucepan and pour over cold water. This helps cook the potatoes evenly. Season the water with salt because it feels weird not to, and bring it to a boil and cook for about 15 minutes in total, or until the potatoes are fork tender. Drain and return to the pot to steam dry and fluff up a bit.
Now, when it comes to actually mashing the potatoes, you've got a few options. First option is one of these, a simple masher. If you want easy convenience, this is going to work a treat. You do it right in the pot, that's going to create a really nice rusted mash with just a few little bumps. Second option is to use one of these, a rice presser. Looks like a live garlic press, but you're going to get a really fine mashed potato with it. Takes a little bit more effort because you've got to scoop it in, but it's still pretty straightforward. Now, if you've not got yourself one of those ricers, but you still want that really fine mash, give a go with a fine mesh sieve. This guy's going to get you the finest mashed potato. It takes a little bit more work to push it through, but once you do, you're going to have really silky smooth mashed potato.
Once potatoes are mashed, I'm going in with some butter and cream that I've warmed up while infusing with a bay leaf to bring incredible flavour and texture. They say that you eat with your eyes, but you definitely cook with your nose. The fragrance from the bay leaf in the cream is heavenly. Stir that in, but don't overmix or it becomes stretchy. Season with salt and finish with a touch more cold butter for some damn fine mash. When your lamb is ready, you should have a deep, rich looking sauce with beautiful lamb. So carefully remove the shanks and leave to rest. These things should be wonderfully tender, so handle with care or that meat will fall right off. For the red wine jus, you could leave it as it is or puree it, but there's something so luxurious about straining out the liquid for that stunningly smooth, glossy feel. Press out the juices into a saucepan. And by the way, that leftover veg is great blended up with some tomatoes for a nice makeshift pasta sauce. And then bring to a simmer if it needs reducing, although mine certainly didn't need to. If you're feeling extra, drop in some cold butter to give it a velvety, glossy finish, and before you know it, you've got beautifully braised lamb with the ridiculously flavorful red wine gravy to go with it. Spread out the mash on a plate, and to look all fancy, keep the lamb on the bone and serve on top. Then pour over a generous amount of the sauce, and maybe put it into a jug first. I make these mistakes intentionally to show you what not to do. All part of the plan, I swear. And yeah, a meal that wouldn't look out of place in any restaurant, and you can't really go wrong. Soft, tender, delicious, fall off the bone lamb with a creamy mash and beautiful red wine sauce. It doesn't get any better than this, so get cooking.